Parliamentary colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Speaker's House for the latest in our series of lectures by parliamentarians on important themes of public policy. I think I've made the point before, but I never tire of emphasising that there is one person in the room who has sought to attend every lecture in each of the series stretching back to the start of 2011, and that is the noble Lord Norton of Louth, who's with us tonight. I use the terms that I did advisedly, that he had sought to attend. I think he missed one. He was up in Hull, and he thought, because of extreme bad weather, that the lecture that night would probably be cancelled, and phoned to inquire whether that was the case, and was advised no, the lecture was going ahead. He then made a strenuous effort to get here and did so, but unfortunately the lecture had concluded by that time. But he has sought to attend every one, and he did indeed attend every other single lecture, and he very helpfully edited the first of the lecture series, which was published. So, Philip, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and colleagues and friends of the House, thank you for coming. Our guest tonight is David Davis, and David Davis has been Member of Parliament for Boothbury from 1987 to 97, and for Halton Price and Howden since 1997, with only a modest interruption, self-inflicted, on a matter of principle between, if memory serves me correctly, the 18th of June and the 11th of July of that year, during which time he fought a by-election on his chosen theme of the threat to traditional and precious liberties of the citizen, a by-election in which he was triumphantly returned to represent his constituency. Colleagues, I've known David not since 1987, but since 1989. He was 2 years into his service in the House when I had the pleasure of meeting him. And at that time, David's particular campaign was a bid, successful as it transpired, to get rid of the National Dock Labour Scheme. And I remember us discussing a speech that he was going to make, which he made to very good effect on that subject. He's held a miscellany of different posts over the years, both in government and opposition. Some of you will know that he started out as a PPS. He served as a whip. If I were impolite, I would point out that he was the whip who piloted the Maastricht Bill through Parliament, but I'm not minded to be so impolite, so I won't point that out to you. He served as the Public Service Minister in the major government, and very importantly, I think, as Minister for Europe for a period. In opposition, I indicated he held all sorts of roles, including Chairman of the Conservative Party and Shadow Home Secretary. I hope David won't mind, and indeed I hope he'll take it as a compliment when I say that alongside all the things that he's done in Parliament, and boy did he have a career as a board director of Tate & Lyle, somebody with real bottom, as my late father would have put it, and great commercial experience, I've always felt that perhaps the most significant thing beyond the principled causing of the by-election in his career was that period that David spent as chair of the Public Accounts Committee between 1997 and 2001. His tenure was an illustrious one. He highlighted, as a good chair of the PAC should do, crucial issues of mismanagement, waste, poor decision-making and prioritisation and so on. And he had a terrific knack for getting very, very considerable publicity for the reports of his committee. So David was highly effective in that role, as, to be fair, his successor, Edward Lee, for 2 terms, also was. So he has had a pretty striking parliamentary career over a long period, and I think David is known as someone who speaks without fear or favour. He is absolutely passionate about Parliament, valued traditions, the rights of the citizen, the liberty of the individual, and I think in more recent years he has been particularly preoccupied with the cause of parliamentarism and the role of the legislature as a proper check and brake on the executive branch of our political system. So he's a very, very welcome guest. I think you're going to enjoy hearing what he has to say, and if I know David as well as I think I know him, when he has spoken, you will be in no doubt whatever as to what he has said. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, please give a very warm welcome to David Davis.
It's alarming enough when you stand in front of an audience and you have someone like Philip Norton who's 10 times as expert as you are on the subject you're about to speak on. But it's even more alarming when the person who introduces you knows more about you than you know yourself. I mean, I couldn't for the life of me remember the dates of my by-election. However, the subject tonight, freedom and Parliament. And for centuries, Parliament's been a stalwart, although somewhat erratic, defender of Britain's liberties. But while Parliament is the proud custodian of those liberties, that noble heritage, the liberty that it's tasked with defending is more ancient and more auspicious, frankly, than the establishment of this House. So forgive me for that, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, Parliament is just one of 4 pillars, really, that uphold the sacred traditions of liberty in the UK, and it has not always been, I might say, the strongest of those pillars. Now, liberty is not a uniquely British concept, of course, but the concept of liberty is uniquely woven throughout the fabric of British history and with it the history of Parliament. It reaches back, of course, at least 800 years to the Magna Carta, but probably beyond that to the English Charter of Liberties of 1100, which I think was Henry I, and perhaps even into the ancient Anglo-Saxon common law. And some would argue even that the Magna Carta was the result of the clash of essentially English common law-based rights of individual freedom and property with the more dictatorial continental European royal prerogatives imported by the Normans, but since my name is not Bill Cash, I'll not press that particular piece of ancient Euroscepticism. The liberty of the people, our freedom from oppression and interference, is an inherent right. It's a right that all of us should inherit upon the moment of our birth, albeit in the world at large we forget often that far too few do. And as Thomas Jefferson famously said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course that sentence was incorporated into the founding charter of a new nation that was at the time in rebellion against the British state, but drew its inspiration from centuries of English history. So Parliament can take pride in the role it's played in the evolution of British liberty, to the point that the concept of liberty as a primary inalienable right has been our greatest political export. Through the British Empire, the concept of liberty spread across the world. Traditions of democracy, liberty and the rule of law being the foundation of nations from Washington to Toronto to Delhi to Johannesburg to Canberra, indeed in modern times actually to Berlin and Tokyo, giving hope to millions and combating tyranny and oppression far from these shores. So if ever there was a legacy of which this Parliament should be proud, it's the global acknowledgement of the fundamental and essential importance of liberty. Now, the reason that this tiny country, really, this small island of 60 million people, is as successful as it is and has achieved far more than it has any right to expect, is very much a function of our traditions of liberty. There's no other reason, frankly, why we should be the 6th greatest economic power in the world, with a permanent place in the United Nations Security Council, a lead position in the Commonwealth, a lead position in NATO, and a global reputation for civilised behaviour. There's no other reason that the English language is the global language of science, of the internet, of film, of media, international law and commerce, save that Britain and its institutional heirs and successors have, through the espousal of freedom, liberated the genius of their peoples, not just ours, all those others I talked about, of their peoples in science, trade, art, literature, law, engineering, social innovation, religion, philosophy, politics, and many, many other areas of human endeavour. In a phrase, freedom matters, now as much as ever. It matters for the spiritual health of the human being, but it matters also as essential for the success of our nations and societies. With liberty, each individual controls a product of his or her labour and individual choices. People succeed or fail based on their ability and effort. the empowerment of the individual, the freedom to trade and to interact, however and with whomsoever one chooses, is fundamental to our prosperity. And it's the British concept of freedom that has been carried around the world, replicated across half of it, and has thrived. As John Adam, another American, pointed out, liberty, the unalienable, indefeasible rights of men, were never so skillfully and successfully consulted as in that most excellent monument of human art, the common law of England. Now, part of this is down to England's proud philosophical tradition. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Paine, Jeremy Bentham, Isaiah Berlin, all have intricately examined and discussed liberty, and they are just some among the many who have influenced the evolution of liberty in the UK. But of course, to bring it closer to home, any consideration of liberty is an examination of the balance of power between the citizen and the state. But is liberty, as Montesquieu, the French lawyer Montesquieu, argued, just the right to do what the law permits? For a long time, as a young politician under Margaret Thatcher's premiership, I rather lazily accepted liberty under the law as a truism that described the British Conservative approach to this area of policy. Today, I'm not so sure this is a useful concept, or at least not without careful consideration of the democratic origin of those laws. Thomas Jefferson realised the danger of defining liberty in relation to the law when he said, and I quote, "Rightful liberty is unobstructed action according to our will within limits drawn around us by the equal rights of others. I do not add within the limits of the law, because law is often but the tyrant's will, and always so when it violates the rights of the individual." His point, that while the law can be used to protect liberty, it can also be used to curb it. And in an ideal parliamentary democracy, we do not define liberty with respect to law, but create our laws with respect to liberty. And I'll talk a little later about how close, or not, our Parliament comes to that ideal. Now, since the earliest days of the nation state, there has been a battle to decide the balance of power between the citizen and the state. In the earliest days, when the state was little more than a protection racket, the freedom of the citizen was non-existent. The ascent of civilization has been a story of freedom being given to a greater and greater proportion of our population. From the days of Athens, when it was the privilege of a very few, to the modern liberal democracy, where every citizen can reasonably expect a reasonable degree of freedom. I say being given, but of course freedom was never a gift. It's always been fought for, often ferociously, against the government, the state, that almost never wanted to give up control. In truth, it's the institutions that limit government that are actually the only guarantors of the freedom of the citizen. That's why Parliament is so vital to the liberty of the citizen. Tony Blair would never have seen himself as an enemy of freedom, just the opposite. But as Prime Minister, it was him that said he, quote, asked the police what powers they wanted and then gave them to them. Such is the manner of modern government, where authority will always, to some extent, corrupt. Now, given competing concepts of liberty, it's not surprising that those on both sides of the political spectrum have gravely misunderstood liberty from time to time. Those on the right have often blurred the distinctions between liberty and licence, eradicating the consideration of others' liberty from one's own. Abraham Lincoln, great Republican president, understood this conflict, saying, "The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as a destroyer of liberty." We see this most often today in the unwillingness to make allowance for community interest in having a role in the limitation of free markets, something that was acutely topical in 2008 after some operators in the financial markets took sizable liberties with the interests of the ordinary population. Meanwhile, those on the left have long seen liberty as in opposition to equality, and seek to promote the latter, and in seeking to promote the latter, have repressed the former. Now, Lenin was probably joking, probably being humorous when he said it's true that liberty is so precious that it must be carefully rationed. But many of his intellectual bedfellows would have agreed with the sentiment, and, as in the case of Stalin, some carried it to a terrifying extreme. So Aiming between these two extremes, which is what Parliament does much of the time, is an extremely delicate balancing act. But liberty is most at threat, not when it's between those two extremes, but when the left and right agree that security can only be increased through limiting our freedoms, a bogus notion I'll return to shortly. And as I said before, Parliament is just one of 4 pillars that provide this balance, along with the rule of law, property rights, and a free press. All of these institutions, to a greater or lesser extent, act as guarantors of the liberty we hold dear. Now, without the rule of law and property rights, we have no liberty. Without liberty, we have no prosperity. And freedom of speech and freedom of action are the foundations of our open society, underpinning other liberties. And Parliament is at the heart of an intricate and delicate constitutional web that's evolved over centuries, designed to secure our liberty. And it is only in the last 400, maybe 350 years, that Parliament has risen falteringly to the task of safeguarding our freedom. But the emergence of liberty as a fundamental principle in British politics, of course, predates even that. On June 12th next year, we celebrate the 800th anniversary of an event of extraordinary historical significance. Arguably, for the first time in Britain, the idea that government is subject to law rather than above it took written and long-lasting contractual form in the Magna Carta, what is often seen as the foundation of British liberty. Now, there are only 3 clauses of the Magna Carta still in force, but only one, really, that provides the basis from which a liberty could grow. That's Article 29. I'll read it to you now, because it's very famous and is still terribly important. No freeman shall be taken or imprisoned, or be disseised of his freehold, or liberties, or free customs, or be outlawed, or exiled, or any otherwise destroyed. Nor will we not pass upon him, nor condemn, but by lawful judgment of his peers, or by law of the land. We will sell to no man, we will not deny or defer to any man either justice or right. That clause was written acknowledgement that the supreme power in the land was not the king or the executive today, but the rule of law. And if liberty is freedom from interference, then it's the rule of law that prevents that interference. It is, by the way, in my view, a rather poor reflection of our appreciation of this hugely important event, that a monument was only erected in Runnymede in 1957. And that monument was not erected by the Hansard Society or the Speaker's Trust or something like that. It was erected by the American Bar Association. But if there is any nation that understands the importance of liberty, it's America. And the simple inscription captures the importance perfectly. To commemorate Magna Carta, symbol of freedom under the law. Now, it was Parliament that became the supreme protector of this principle, the embodiment of the rule of law and the defence of the citizen against arbitrary government. And I guess Parliament, in the first instance, emerged from the great councils of the early Norman monarchs, but it was not until the reign of the Tudor monarchs that the modern structure of Parliament began to take shape, with the King, the Lords, the Commons and the Speaker assuming their constitutional positions, and the Palace of Westminster under Henry VIII becoming the seat of Parliament. But while it was the Tudors that formalised Parliament's position, it was the Stuarts who revolutionised it. And it was, as these things so often are, an entirely unintended consequence. This revolution was started by James I, ironically a man who wrote a treatise extolling the virtues of the divine right of kings. By antagonising Parliament in his attempts to exert ever greater authority, James I provoked Parliament into issuing the Form of Apology and Satisfaction of 1604. The apology declared that the freedom embedded in the privileges of the House belongs not merely to its members, it belonged to all English commoners, to the whole English people, and has been theirs for time immemorial. It is the condition of their liberty. To deny the liberties of the House of Commons, to allege that they depend on the monarch's will, is to deny all subjects their most important freedom, their liberty freely to consent to the laws by which they are governed. The apology illustrated the most fundamental link between Parliament's privileges and the people's liberties. Now, Parliament's function as the guardian of Englishmen's rights, necessitated freedom for members to express their own views on all topics that concerned the liberty of the subject. And it's for this it was essential to maintain parliamentary privilege. Now, whilst James I caused Parliament to take some genteel measures in defence of liberty, it was his son Charles I who forced Parliament to take up arms for it. Now, Charles had an even more fractious relationship with Parliament than his father and expressed regular frustration with Parliament's frequent curtailment of his authority. In response, Parliament passed a Petition of Right in 1628, decrying the actions of the King, expressly restating the validity of the principles of Magna Carta and underlining the legal requirement of habeas corpus. The petition was a powerful statement in defence of liberty. For the first time, Parliament was explicitly expressing its strong opposition to the arbitrary power of the executive. But as powerful a statement as the Petition of Right was, Parliament was forced to take much greater measures only a few years later, as the conflict between the power of the monarch and the rule of law came to a head in the English Civil War. Now, the Civil War, of course, as we all know, was brutal and bloody, a clash not only between countrymen but between divine right and the rule of law. But it was also a powerful expression of Parliament's growing commitment to the rule of law that when peace was once again established, Charles was put on trial rather than being summarily executed, symbolically exhibiting that he too was subject to the rules of the land, the laws of the land. Civil war usually ends in shattering of peoples and nations. It is quintessentially English that our civil law ended in a trial. Our civil war ended in a trial and the confirmation of the rule of law. And while the progress of liberty stalled during the interregnum and the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution was the last farewell gift from the Stuarts. It was a turning point, a truly sublime occurrence in the history of liberty in Britain. So when James II was deposed, it was Parliament that offered William and Mary the crown of England and set out the terms of the new constitutional settlement and the Bill of Rights. National religious concerns and the side effects of the War of the Grand Alliance in Europe had delivered yet another unexpected leap forward in domestic British liberty. Yet again, an unintended consequence. And among all the vested interests, and I'm conscious that we have Jacob Rees-Mogg in the audience, among all the vested interests about Catholic succession, the Bill of Rights was a hidden masterpiece, embodying many of the ideas of John Locke, and the Bill codified liberty as our system of justice. So, supremacy of Parliament and the rule of law over the executive was, in theory, complete. The concept of liberty as a fundamental and inalienable right, protected by a Parliament and the rule of law, had gone from a weak implication in the Apology of 1604 to a firm and absolute declaration in the Bill of Rights in 1689. As a result, Britain became seen as a torchbearer for liberty in the civilised world. And as torchbearer, Britain spread this devotion to liberty around the world. The American Revolution was rooted in English concepts of liberty. The United States Declaration of Independence declared all men created equal and independent. And from that equal creation, they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Jefferson again. The Declaration was an expression of principles, liberty and the rule of law, for which the English had fought their Civil War a century before. So liberty's progress may have been slow, but it's been cumulatively great. We've come a long way from our early constitutional struggles, and every step of the journey is imprinted with Parliament's footstep. But of course, liberty in the UK is not just a historic question. Questions over the liberty of the British people are as important today as they have ever been. The threat no longer comes from an overpowering monarch, or the sort of terrifying existential threat put to this nation by the Nazi terror or indeed the Soviet threat. But the threat that authority presents to liberty still resides within government today. Rather than grand and obvious threats, our liberty is now subject to a slow but creeping erosion, less dramatic but far more difficult to resist. Now, I've often argued the influence of the executive over Parliament is too great. As members of Parliament, we are often too quick to give up the privileges that previous parliaments have bitterly fought to protect. As the Apology of 1604 declared, these privileges are the property of the people and are not ours to concede. And because of this steady erosion, we find ourselves in a situation where the influence of the executive over Parliament is now considerable. Government largely controls the business of the House, granting crucial power over the programme of legislation. The influence that the government gains through the control of the business of the House is immense. This makes it easy for the executive to get its way, and doubly hard for Parliament to fulfil its role of defending our freedoms. Now, responsibility for the business of the House was ceded to the government in the 1880s to counter the blocking procedural tactics of the Irish nationalists, taken from the Speaker of the day, I guess. As the government no longer faces such blocking tactics, shouldn't we think it's time to return some responsibility for the business of the House to the Speaker of the House, sir? Without control of House business, we are often left with insufficient time to debate through critical issues like Syria or English votes in the 6 minutes that the majority of MPs are routinely accorded. Compare this to the 263 minutes that backbencher Ivan Lawrence spoke for during the water fluoridation debate in 1985. Not that I'm holding that up as a model, but it does put in context our debates on really rather more important issues today. Multi-day sittings, which ought to be the normal occurrence for major events, instead are now almost non-existent outside of estimates days and finance bills. Parliament has been made to pass entire repressive acts within a single day. That's the level of esteem with which our government and most modern governments hold parliamentary debate. The Reform Committee of the last Parliament's proposal of a Business of the House Committee, comprised of representatives of all parts of the House with a direct interest, backbenchers, government and opposition, would do much to allow the House to set its own agenda, as proper separation of powers would recommend. Promised by the Conservatives in opposition, we have yet to see it implemented. And the reason it hasn't happened is it would have an astonishing effect on the activity and decisiveness of the House of Commons. The only times that the government, in my view, in this Parliament have really been held to account are during debates, to a very large extent, that wish had not occurred. This happened with the debate over military action in Syria, which they could not avoid, and they lost. With debate over votes for prisoners that Jack Straw and I put up in the House, and with the backbench EU referendum debate. All debates the government would rather had not happened. Then there is significant blurring between government and Parliament. A large proportion of members, a growing number each Parliament as the executive expands, also being members of the government. This came up in today's debate in the House, when one member pointed out that something like 150 members of the government, members of the House, were dependent in one way or another upon the government. With the government holding absolute power over career progress, members can be far less independent independent-minded than they once were. Now, despite this has actually been one of the most rebellious parliaments of recent times. But this has been to little effect, due to the government's influence over Parliament and the opposition's unwillingness at times to oppose. When the front benches agree, the power of the whip system ensures that the most effective backbench rebels are in fact neutered by numbers. Our system of patronage also remains riddled with cronyism and undemocratic practices. Despite the last government and this one committing to reform, the abuse of the patronage system is still widespread, with the upper chamber, forgive me, stuffed with political appointees and career politicians. The combination of all these factors greatly limits Parliament's ability to counter the influence of the executive and properly balance our constitutional position. And so Parliament has in modern times failed on a number of occasions to fulfil its greatest role, protecting the liberty of the citizens from the encroachment of executive power. It's infuriating that in the last decade or two, while Parliament has shown enormous courage in standing up for liberty, it's also shown appalling weakness in allowing its erosion. On the credit side of the balance, the House of Commons rejected, after fiery debate, the Blair government's proposal for 90 days detention without charge. It did so in the immediate aftermath of the 7/7 bombing in which over 50 innocent people were killed. Making such clear-headed judgments is never more difficult than in the high emotional pitch, the emotional public mood that follows such atrocities. It is a huge compliment to Parliament that it did so, and, incidentally, to the courage of the 30 or so Labour MPs that broke ranks to make it happen. On the debit side, only 5 months ago, Parliament allowed the government to ram through the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act 2014 in one day to deal with a patently bogus emergency. Parliament allowed, with effectively no scrutiny, the sort of erosion of privacy by the state that is constitutionally banned in a number of European states, not least the German state. So Parliament can be brave and Parliament can be useless. It is, in short, erratic. I don't know whether you're cheering brave or useless there, but now, while the DRIP Act, the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act, in many ways represented the pinnacle of disregard for liberty and Parliament by this particular government, it's by no means the only recent undermining of our personal liberty. A huge quantity of anti-terror legislation has been rushed through Parliament in the last 3 or 4 decades without proper scrutiny. Take, for example, to cast our mind back a bit, the Prevention of Terrorism Temporary Provisions Act. I always love temporary provisions, they never are. Temporary Provisions Act hurried through Parliament in 1974, introduced in the aftermath of the Birmingham bombing and passed in 4 days under emergency legislation procedures. The powers it contained were described by the Home Secretary who presented it, Roy Jenkins himself, as draconian, unprecedented in peacetime. Ironically, it was steered through the House by Jenkins, the best, the most intellectually commanding, the most liberal and the most successful Home Secretary of the 20th century. The fact that he promoted this draconian nonsense tells us the fault for these actions lies not with the individual Home Secretary or even Prime Minister, but with a systemic failure in the institution of government. Powers that are considered draconian even by those that demand them will always erode liberty and never increase our security. Social order at the expense of liberty is hardly a bargain, even if it works. And the illiberal actions in Northern Ireland made things worse, not better, which is now widely recognised. And we then had further anti-terrorism legislation in 1998, 2001, 2005. Indeed, the 2001 emergency legislation passed just months after the Terrorism Act 2000, itself supposedly the last word in counter-terrorism legislation for a generation. That's how it was presented. And whenever government used emergency legislation in response to a terrorist threat, they have tended to engineer a theatrical emergency to justify it. Emergencies have always been the pretext on which safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. Following the passing of the draconian 1974 Act, it was subsequently revealed that the government had been secretly drafting the legislation since 1973, waiting for an opportunity, frankly, waiting for an atrocity to introduce it. And the move to push through such wide-ranging powers as emergency legislation following the Birmingham bombing, which was widely applauded at the time, was in fact a deeply cynical act. In the case of the Data Retention Act I mentioned earlier, the government had 3 months from when the European Court of Justice struck down the existing legislation to put alternative measures in place. Yet the government waited until the last minute before using emergency powers to ram this legislation through Parliament in one day. We, the parliamentarians, were prevented from fulfilling Parliament's ancient role of scrutiny and debate, limiting the ability of Parliament to defend the liberty of the people. Now, at one level, the motives of the executive are understandable. The problem lies with the sheer inevitability of terrorist events. They happen no matter how effective you are. That's what happens in a free society. It even happens in a totalitarian society. Any Prime Minister, any Home Secretary, never want it said that they did not do everything in their power to prevent people dying in a terrorist event. Unfortunately, that mindset is not one that is conducive to the defence of liberty. It is, bluntly, political cowardice masquerading as courage. And government is always inclined, as my Tony Blair quote expressed, to follow the advice provided by the police and the intelligence services. But for Parliament to be so negligent of its duty to liberty by allowing the use of bogus emergencies to pass draconian legislation is in itself a dark stain on Parliament's otherwise proud record. These emergency bills were on the whole bad legislation, and many of the powers have never been used. But they've all played a part in the steady erosion of our liberty without any concrete evidence that they reduce the threat posed by those who would do us harm. The government's use of emergency legislation procedures shuts down effective scrutiny of the law and grotesquely limits the time available for proper debate, both in our chambers and in the public sphere. Expert parties, members of the public, lose the ability to lobby members, undermining the fundamental structure of representative democracy. The belief in liberty and the rule of law is undermined as a result. Now, barely a year goes by where there have not been new proposals to counter the ever more severe threat we are supposed to face. Let's take one example: detention without charge. The original power in the 1974 provisions to detain without charge was 48 hours. This time limit was then extended in 2000 to 7 days detention, then doubled in 2003 to 14 days. In 2006, it was increased to 28 days, although the Blair government declared that 90 days detention was required. By the way, the only other major country outside the Soviet bloc and the Chinese bloc that had 90 days was South Africa under apartheid. In 2008, the Brown government again tried to increase the detention without charge period, this time to 42 days. So the pattern is clear to see. At no point in all that time was evidence ever presented to Parliament that more than 13 days was necessary, which is why this incoming government, could reduce it back to 14 days in the first idealistic 6 months after the 2010 election. Now, our willingness to erode the liberties of those we dislike, with scant regard for the rule of law, is a dangerous road to start down. It's a road which will lead to the diminishing of everyone's liberty. Thomas Paine warned once that he that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression, for if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself. Well, I can pick you an example from this year. You need look no further than the Home Secretary's extremism disruption orders announced at this year's Conservative Party conference. The criteria for stripping a citizen of their freedom of expression, their freedom of movement, and even their freedom of association seems to include, amongst other things, causing alarm or distress. Now, I suspect, that the Home Secretary finds this speech alarming and distressing. If not, I've not done my job this evening. But I hardly think that that is a reason to take away my democratic rights. I don't imagine it will happen, but that is what she proposes to put on the statute book. So what all modern governments have done is offer a false bargain, and that bargain masquerades as more security for less liberty. What in practice it turns out to be is no more security and sometimes less security for less liberty. The simple fact of the matter is that terrorism is considerably more frightening than it is dangerous. There is no doubt that the threat posed by terrorism to the general population has been consistently used by successive governments to ease the passage of controversial and excessively draconian legislation. There is little evidence that this has made us safer. And to bring this really up to date, all of this is made more important by the massive technological changes sweeping through our society. The internet revolution means that huge amounts of data about every individual are in circulation. Their financial status, their medical records, their minute-by-minute location. All of your phones are as good as tags, I should tell you. Their interests, their spending, their thoughts, their queries, their political ideas, their sexual preferences and activities, their friendships, their hatreds. These are all accessible, and particularly for the younger generation. Now, even the lowliest county police force has access to information that the Stasi would have given their right arm for, and the state as a whole has much more. Now, that doesn't make your local police force a Stasi, obviously not. It certainly does not make our state a police state. But the mechanisms are in place. So it does create a new concern that this House should concern itself with. It means that defence of privacy, whether from the state or from mega corporations like Google and Microsoft, is not now just a subset of the defence of freedom. Once upon a time, privacy was just a piece of the freedom argument. It means it's now central to the defence of freedom. And this is all happening at a time when the other defences of freedom, the free press, the rule of law, and property rights, are also declining. In its 300-year history, British press freedom has faced many threats. That's no surprise. A truly free press is a probing, scrutinising press, one that makes life uncomfortable for governments. But today's press is as weak as it has been for at least a century. The rule of law, too, is under challenge, particularly international law. Remember, international law is the one that actually constrains what governments and executives can do. And property rights even are changing. 20 years ago, property rights largely referred to physical assets, physical property, which was well defended in law. Today, virtual property, intellectual property, property in your own identity have become far more important and are very, very much less well protected. Now, all these trends are slow, but they're all in one direction. They reinforce the need for Parliament to take even more seriously its role as a bastion of liberty in this country. Now, the modern defence of liberty by Parliament has come under great pressure from a number of factors. The lack of parliamentary independence, the balance of power between the government and the backbenches, the common views between government and opposition frontbenches, that security matters more than liberty, leaving it to the backbenches to uphold Parliament's ancient duty. All of these, taken together, have led to a slow rebalancing of power, which has allowed the steady erosion of our liberty. Now, if I was starting from a blank sheet of paper, if I could rewrite our Constitution today, I would start with a much more German or American model. I'd start with a written Constitution, and I'd look towards far more separation of powers. But that's not going to happen in Britain in the next week, month, year, decade, 3, 10 decades, probably not, certainly not in my lifetime. So what can we do that's practical? One simple, subtle, but enormously significant step would be to achieve the return of control of the House agenda to Parliament and give the right to initiate action and legislation back to Parliament itself. Then should we need to debate going to war, the Speaker could give us 2 days for debate, not 1. And we wouldn't have to analyse the whole Middle Eastern problem in 6 minutes. Should we need to debate emergency counter-terrorism, the Speaker should give us a week rather than a day. And when the Commons felt collectively that the government was not standing up for the rights of the people or was undermining them, a substantive motion or even legislation could be presented that would bind the government rather than merely advise. If we are to meet the expectations that are placed upon this House in support of liberty, then we should heed once more the words of Thomas Jefferson. His words, and I quote, "Timid men prefer the calm of despotism to the tempestuous sea of liberty." And perhaps we should replace that timidity with more tempestuous debate. We must be bold in our confirmation and defence of the liberty of every British citizen. We must remember that the privileges and authorities of Parliament are not ours to give away. As with the liberty of the nation, we hold them on trust for our constituents and exercise them in the interests of the nation. Life, liberty and property do not exist because men have made laws and raised governments. On the contrary, it was the fact that life, liberty and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place and base those laws on an idea. That idea is called freedom, and it's still the most exciting, progressive and successful idea the world has ever known. Thank you.